I'd also like to affirm that we're standing on Noongar Whadjuk land and pay my respects there. I better get into the presentation today, given the time limits. And I hope this works. Yes, first slide. What's been going on quite recently, and this is going on through sort of educational journals and in discussion around Holocaust pedagogy and at primary school and high school level, is a slight switch in thinking around perhaps some of the fallibilities of empathetic engagement, and certainly other ways of thinking about how you teach representations. Obviously, the field of Holocaust and genocide studies clearly has a strong human rights animus. It's dedicated to genocide prevention. One of the major associations for genocide studies has genocide prevention as its explicit remit, and actually it'll have its major conference in Brisbane next year. And this field is interested in incapacitating, as opposed to incapacitating, is capacitating students to oppose any form of prejudice or discrimination. In the last few years in particular, we've, and it's probably correlating a little bit with new and emerging forms of literary narrative, a little bit more focused on perpetrators. For example, there has emerged an increasing suspicion that an empathetic focus on historical victimhood is inadequate to the cultivation of civic virtues in children and young people. And what I've just done there is listed a few of the areas of concern. One is that there's a sort of emotional over-arousal that goes on where one identifies either with a pure victim or someone with a sort of heroic or redemptive narrative, so that we don't get sufficient critical reflection on institutional context, conceptions of community and effective dispositions that generate iniquity. The other is the assimilation of the other into one's own experiential horizons, which can generate something of a saviour complex. A lot of the debates that go on around historical fiction, particularly over Kate Grenville, is whether one can actually write historical fiction using some kind of empathetic methodology where you imagined what it would have been like and what people would have been thinking and feeling, which potentially ignores the alterity of the past. We also can get, of course, if we identify with victims, which can have geopolitical ramifications where we consider a victim to belong to a kind of perennially victim identity. We end up congratulating ourselves for our identification with that victim. That can generate moral complacency. Certainly there's a suspicion that texts that are considered to have profound testimonial value and need to be archived and so on, and considered to be a sort of considered to be often a kind of defence against recidivism, denialism, Holocaust denialism and so on, which we spoke about yesterday. You then get a certain pressure to celebrate that text or not to engage with it critically enough. So there are certain issues that are now being dealt with. When I talk about empathy in particular, obviously empathy is a kind of theory of mind. Empathy in particular is thought of as the pro-social or beneficial enactment of a theory of mind, the capacity that human beings have to imagine what someone else might be thinking and feeling and what motivates their actions. It's a slightly complex area given that actually a lot of psychopaths are well known to have excellent theory of mind which they then manipulate. So that's why I emphasise the pro-social there. Anne Ryder, who's a sort of in Holocaust studies at Indiana University, has written an excellent article actually where she says that a truly ethical Holocaust pedagogy is much more likely to be successful by not only developing empathic capacity for victims of abuse, but also recognition of the banal ideologies and institutions occupied by the perpetrators. Clearly a bit of a nod there to Hannah Arendt's conception of the banality of evil. Her idea is that we need to help students see that ordinary people can become bystanders and perpetrators, and that is in fact essential if they are to recognise injustice in their own environment. So this is the kind of pedagogical nub of the issue. How do we get students to translate their historical understanding into a meaningful understanding of contemporary injustices, rather than again simply accepting that there's good and evils and not necessarily complex shades what I wanted to talk about just a little bit in this short presentation is my own teaching practice, where I do teach and write about a number of texts that disrupt or problematise empathic or empathetic identification, and these texts do so either by relaxing historical reference — you'll see what that means, that should become clearer in a moment — or creating complex bridging characters who mediate our interpretations of events. What I mean in number one there by relaxing historical reference, we'll see that in relation to Sophie Scholl in just a moment, are films where the director has actually deliberately defamiliarised our understanding of a history that has become recognised through various iconic signs and tropes, particularly Nazi swastikas and so on, and they try to actually create films where we're not at a visibly recognisable, aberrant, malicious historical world where we can just enjoy the entertainment of caricatured Nazis. There's something much more complex going on, and in fact, some of the dialogical scenarios where someone who is an advocate for justice and human rights is actually facing quite a complex antagonist who is actually using their own moral vocabulary. So this is where these texts are becoming increasingly interesting. Number three there pertains more to graphic novels which create avatars or bridging characters who help to mediate so a classic one will be Mouse. They help to mediate our understanding of the journey one must go through, both to engage with the testimony of a survivor or witness, but sometimes to problematise that testimony, and sometimes to think through one's own implication in the story that is being told. This is Mark Rothman, director of Sophie Scholl, which was nominated for an Academy Award. Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. I'll say more about the film in a moment, but I found this a really fascinating quote. He spends about 10 minutes insisting that the film is historically accurate because it's based on recently released transcripts from the Gestapo, where Sophie Scholl is interrogated in her final days, and eventually says, yes, I did this, I collaborated with my brother and we did do this pamphleteering and so on, and we protested against Nazi criminality. What he says there, and I won't read it all out, but he makes a certain number of points that I think are common to a range of pedagogically useful Holocaust-themed texts. He's cutting down the distance so that what one is looking at no longer looks like it's simply a period drama. It's slightly less disconcerting in that manner. One can start to actually engage with human beings rather than sort of immediately feel horrified by the impact of Nazi brutality, as one would have felt, particularly watching a film like Schindler's List, for example. Very, very interesting when he says, I'm not trying to visually reproduce historical scenes, but explore current issues. And in fact, Julia Jentsch, who plays Sophie Scholl, also says, look, we didn't bother too much to get her Swabian accent accurate. It actually was a hybrid accent. Again, we weren't trying to create anything that could be easily reified as a kind of historical sign or sign of historical authenticity. And in that way, we open up this contemporary question around civil courage, which of course young people constantly need to think about in relationship to various problems in the world, racism, bullying and various other kinds of injustice. I just thought I'd give you a quick sense of what you actually see. She's in a, she spends most of the film in a red cardigan. She is actually toured around by various kinds of functionaries who are actually, they're not recognisable Nazi soldiers, they're civil servants, functionaries, eventually a Gestapo interrogator, who are confronted by her idealism, but also are enjoying a moment of kind of ressentiment where they get to kind of strike back at someone who is perceived as youthful and privileged and so on. Of course, Sophie Scholl was one of the foremost participants of the White Rose movement, a non-violent intellectual resistance group in Nazi Germany, led by a group of students and a professor at the University of Munich. They conducted an anonymous leaflet and graffiti campaign decrying the war and the persecution and murder of the Jews, and they called for active opposition against the Nazi regime. They released about 15 pamphlets. She was eventually sentenced to death in February 1943 by a kind of kangaroo court, the so-called Nazi People's Court, and the film itself is about the final 12 days of her interrogation by someone, an interesting character actually, if we think back to number 2, a Gestapo interrogator called Robert Moore. Actually, I'll just give you an image there for a sec. And so what you actually get is someone representing themselves as a patriotic citizen, someone who is following the law, because in fact all of these acts are in a sense legal. So it's all about the question of when is this civil disobedience required, something I think we need to ask ourselves in the current situation with refugees, which has of course been going on increasingly even in recent weeks at Parliament House. This is a really nice quote from Wendy McElroy kind of explaining the pedagogical strategy, which is, yes, again, we're not immediately thrown into actually a strangely comforting scene of jackbooted Nazis. What we actually get is a sense of, well, how did people begin to routinise this kind of, this kind of persecution, and how do people begin to absolve themselves of responsibility for what they're actually doing and deny their complicity, which any human rights advocate actually needs to deal with. So this is about empowering, in a sense, the human rights advocate with various kinds of arguments and rhetorical strategies. It's also giving some psychological insight into various typologies of perpetrators, sociologically and psychologically informed insights, which the Hollywood caricatured characterisation simply doesn't give us. This is a text I do teach in a first year unit. I know I've got a little bit of dense text there, but just bear with me. The similarity here is that if you look at Art Spiegelman's, so this is Mouse. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning hybrid graphic novel. It's got two levels of narrative. One is about a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor named Wladek, who is the father of its author, Art Spiegelman. He survived Auschwitz with a combination of luck, ingenuity and resourcefulness. So there's all of his extraordinary travails during that period of the sort of early 1940s. Another level of the text is set in contemporary New York, late 70s, early 80s. It's a kind of Kutzler roman in which young Artie, who wants to become a comics cartoonist, who draws himself as a character into this narrative. He suffers from second generation angst. He feels guilt. He feels insignificant because of the experiences of his father and family. At the same time, he's struggling with antagonistic feelings towards his father, who is not a sentimentalised character at all in this graphic novel. He finds him extremely difficult. There's an early fascinating picture early on in Mouse in which he's shown riding a bike in a sense simply he's on an exercise bike. He's simply treading water in a sense and not making progress because of his PTSD. He's shown as extremely frugal, as extremely difficult, and he's shown as quite racist in one of the later vignettes in Mouse, in which he's shown as not wanting to pick up an African-American hitchhiker, which is making a subtle indexical point about perhaps the direction of American Jewish politics towards supporting an ethno-state like Israel, if we want to be frank about it. It's not commenting on that directly, but it's hinting in that direction. So raises all sorts of interesting issues. What these quotes, the quote I've drawn attention to actually shows you is that Art Spiegelman himself was absolutely determined that you would not have any kind of easy, at times sentimentally identifying with the storyline and in a sense even the victims that were being portrayed. He's basically saying, look, there's different levels of textual significance. The meaning lies somewhere between image and text. I've used the drawing of animals precisely so that you don't feel again that you're looking at an actual reproduction of events. He even says, I didn't want it to be some sort of lachrymose narrative where you cry about the fate of the 6 million. I'm pretty much quoting Art Spiegelman there. He wanted to be much more complex and grainy than that. And of course, those other quotes talk. Hilary Schute's a major theorist of the graphic novel, and she talks about the kind of estranging and defamiliarising effects of reading graphic novels that are very kind of complex in tone and mood, and certainly don't always proceed in a linear fashion as we read them. This is a very famous page from Mouse, where there's always the danger. I mean, for one thing, we're seeing the effects of trying to reproduce Vladek's narrative. We see Artie's kind of mask actually falling off. In a sense, we see this whole representational strategy of representing the Jews as mice, and the Nazis or Germans as cats, and the Poles as pigs, and so on. The French as frogs. We see this, actually now being, showing that it is a representational device. When he's talking to his shrink or his psychologist, because he suffers from depression, he was institutionalised, Art Spiegelman, he basically says, I'm not sure why we do this. Does one more representation make any difference whatsoever? The Czech Jewish psychologist Pavel basically says, we get more and more stories, but human beings actually behave more and more outrageously all the time. And even in a moment of angst says, maybe we need a new and bigger Holocaust. So you can see this is not a kind of typical kind of pious Holocaust narrative at all. But then we get this beautiful moment where it says, we're in that bind. We're not sure if there's any point in saying something, but we have to continue to struggle for representation, narrativisation, and of course Mouse itself represents a performative enactment of a different mode of representing Holocaust narrative. So students particularly enjoy this particular panel. This is Joe Sacco. I'll get onto Palestine in a moment, but he also has an idea that, look, I don't reproduce the truth. My drawings, and this is graphic reporting, I try to be as accurate as I can, but they are irreducibly and inevitably interpretive. I must use my informed imagination. And then he's talking here about his avatar. He's saying most journalists write themselves out of the narrative that they're telling. I didn't even try. It was a window or opportunity for me to create myself as a character. But that character, again, is not equivalent to the actual human being or author or biographical author Joe Sacco. Let's just look at a few moments from Palestine. Let me just give you a tiny bit of information on Palestine. It's a graphic novel, one of the seminal works of what's now called graphic reportage. It's his travels in Palestine around the Intifada, late in the Intifada, which I think began in 87, 92, 93 is the period that he's there in the occupied territories. It was published in its entirety in 2001. It's an assembly of 9 stories that first began publication in 1993, and the 2001 edition has a wonderful introduction by Edward Said. It focuses on the minute details of everyday life in the occupied territories, presenting the daily struggles, humiliations and frustrations of the Palestinians, but also their quiet persistence and steadfastness, and even willingness to continue to educate themselves as a community ready for political independence. The focus on the occupation includes the maiming and wounding of young people, house demolitions, demolition of olive crops, torture by the Shin Bet, and the routine policy of imprisoning Palestinian young males as a matter of state policy. But then again, there's all sorts of political mobilisation and adult education that goes on within the jail system. So it's by no means a completely pessimistic narrative. Let's look though at the avatar, because I've only got a few moments left. This is the avatar you will see in any Joe Sacco graphic novel, Safe Area Garage Day, for example, which is about the Bosnian conflict. And of course, he's showing himself with opaque spectacles. So it's a bit of a play on. It might be a play on Tiresias, the blind prophet, or it might simply be suggesting that his vision and clarity are in fact problematic. So it's got all sorts of polyvalent significances here. Now, what he does is he says, look, I'm not just arriving here and I'm a tabula rasa, I'll tell you what's going on in Palestine, I'll solve problems and so on, as even the occasional humanitarian feels that they will be able to solve problems. Instead, he says, actually, there's a long lineage of Orientalism. He says, he compares himself to a kind of intrepid explorer, but then finds himself getting into a taxi. And of course, all of his journeys will be absolutely reliant and dependent on Indigenous guides, if you want to put it that way, who know a lot more than he does and show him extraordinary hospitality. We were just talking about stringers, was it, in the photojournalism talk yesterday. But then he is quickly into the settlements. This is actually showing the topography of the occupation, which we don't often see. In fact, it's a highly verbal discourse whenever we hear the Palestinian occupation discussed, which of course gets us into thinking that maybe it's not so bad over here. In fact, what we see are kind of military fortresses on the heights, which will dominate the Palestinian territories. This is a really, really interesting moment. Of course, sometimes he would like to simply be there as a reporter, but he continually has to. He suddenly finds that unwittingly he's got a guidebook, an Australian guidebook at that orientalises Palestinians as rather primitive, backward, peasant people, falahin and so on. And in fact, that's not the case at all. The entire narrative shows that Palestinians are extremely keen on new technologies, on educating themselves. They're very globally aware. They always want to have a conversation about, well, how are we being represented overseas? And so on. So this is a powerful rebuke to his own slightly unwitting implication in the history of Orientalist representations. I'm sorry about all the... does that... Oh, no, sorry, I thought that middle one... what's the one that, does a flash, highlights? Finish up, yeah. So anyway... so this is him getting into this idea that he's got a vicarious enjoyment of tales of brutality. He's thinking about his journalistic copy. He's suddenly reminded of the effects his actual presence there can have. The people that are talking to him and showing him this hospitality in Palestinian lounge rooms across the territories are actually in grave danger from Israeli authorities, but nevertheless feel the need to get their story out. Occasionally he reaches, this is the final slide, a complete impasse where he has to recognise that the story of Palestinian suffering is out there, and yet we are not seeing any meaningful results in terms of the even in terms of the enforcing of basic human rights for Palestinians, basic political rights, rights to education, and so on. And he's so embarrassed by this, he simply says at the end, "Where are my shoes?" And this is quite common in graphic novels. Rather than a progressive narrative where we feel we're making some sort of ethical progress, often characters simply admit their awkwardness and embarrassment, but then somehow continue to press on and muddle their way through anyway, which is sometimes all we can do in the field of human rights. So that is a presentation. Thank you very much for your time.